The next report we will see is the transaction report, which shows the successful as well as declined transactions, unlike the financial report, which only shows the successful transactions and the actions that happened on them. The purpose of this report is to show why a transaction was declined and at what stage it was declined. As you can see, you can search the transactions with date as well, with a limitation of 5,000 transactions per showing. Now we will explain the statuses in details. Drop status happens if the cardholder closes the browser after clicking on Pay Now, or an internet or technical failure happens that would interrupt the transaction. In review status is dedicated only to specific merchants that are enrolled for an additional layer of fraud security, which is red. If one of the fraud rules are triggered on the red tool, the transaction status will show in review, which is actually considered a successful transaction. However, it gives you the opportunity of investigating the transaction, or you can send it to our risk team on risk@payfort.com. Incomplete status is related to security as well, where the two layers of fraud security, which are 3D Secure and the Payfort Basic Fraud module, are incomplete. So if the client fails to authenticate, the transaction will be incomplete due to 3D Secure failure. And if any of the fraud rules are triggered during the transaction, it will be blocked by the Payfort risk team. On hold status is limited to merchant page integration type only. So if you are using a merchant page integration, make sure you are sending all the transactions to the 3D Secure URL. Otherwise, it will be on hold. It can also happen if the client does not enter the one-time password on the 3D Secure page. In that case, Payfort is waiting for the cardholder's action, so it would be on hold. Open status does not mean the transaction is successful or declined. It can be anything. So if it's open with a successful transaction, this means that another action is possible. So if it is a successful transaction, you can process a refund. And if it is a successful authorization, you can process capture. And if you do take an action and process a refund of the full amount, the transaction status will be closed. Processing status happens when the transaction is loading, so it's a temporary status. And after it loads, it will automatically change into any of the above statuses. As discussed previously in the financial report, you can search transactions with the Fort ID, merchant reference, payment method, or payment option. Let's search for transactions with this date range. You can export this report to Excel, CSV, PDF, or XML. As you can see the Fort ID, which is the transaction reference generated by Payfort. Then we have the merchant reference, which is the order ID created by your website. Then we have the authorization code, which is a simple way to determine whether or not a transaction is successful. If the authorization code is there, then this means that the transaction was successfully authorized. You can see the payment option being used: MasterCard, Visa, Sadad, etc. You can see the channel which is configured during integration, date and time of transaction, amount, currency, and status. The status is closed, so we will open this transaction to see what the closed status looks like in detail. And the closed status indicates that a full refund has been performed. And because it is a successful transaction, so both the 3D Secure and fraud are green. Below, we can see the transaction details. Over here, we can see two operations. Initially, the transaction was successful with purchase operation, and status was open. But after the refund was processed, the status changed to closed, as no more actions can be taken on this transaction. Let's have a look in detail on a drop transaction, which, as we discussed before, was interrupted due to technical errors or closing of payment page before payment and not proceeding to the 3D Secure page. That's why the 3D Secure is red, meaning the transaction never reached the 3D Secure page, and that's why the operation shows no result found, because no action happened on this transaction yet. Next, we will see how an open transaction looks in detail, and as you can see, it has an authorization code, meaning it was successful. Again, because it was a successful transaction, then the 3D Secure and fraud are green, as the transaction was authenticated and no fraud rules were triggered. Below, there is only one operation that can be done, which is purchase. So if this transaction is partially refunded, the status will remain open, and if refunded fully, the status will be closed, as no other actions will be possible in this case. Let's take a look at what other options we can see. Let's try the incomplete transactions. So these are our incomplete transactions. And because it was a declined transaction, there is no authorization code. Let's open the details. As we previously agreed, an incomplete transaction is related to security, and there are two layers of security. One is 3D Secure, which is controlled by the card issuing bank, and the other is fraud. In this transaction, the status is incomplete due to failure of 3D Secure, where the cardholder failed to submit the correct 3D Secure password, and it's a declined transaction, so no results will be found in the operations. The second reason a transaction might be incomplete is due to fraud, where a fraud rule is triggered and the transaction will be blocked by PayFort system, and instead of the red 3D Secure, we will have a red fraud option. But in this case, it never reached the PayFort level, as it was unsuccessful on the 3D Secure level only. We press the back button. So this is basically the transaction report, and if you would like to see a dedicated report on fraud blocked and 3D Secure failure transactions, you can go through these two reports. Let's see them in more detail. Fraud report. As we know, we could search transactions with Fort ID or merchant reference, and if you want to see all the transactions, you can search by date. As you can see, all the transactions are successful, which does not mean that the transaction was successful. It only means that there was no fraud rule triggered during the transaction. If there was any fraud rule triggered during the transaction and the transaction was blocked by PayFort, over here you will see a fraud reason. It can be card country blocking, IP country block, or any other reason which we will discuss later on in details. You will not be able to perform any actions on the fraud transactions as it's controlled by our risk team only.